And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
It is indeed Friday, and welcome to yet another episode of Climate Change Roundtable, number 62 in a series. Today, we're going to be embracing petro-masculinity. Yes, you heard that right. That's the new term the left has invented to slur people that, use fossil fuels or climate deniers or people that just drive their cars. You're petro-masculine, you're evil. Ugh. Anyway, here's our regular team with us today. We've got Sterling and Linnea, and I'm really interested in the take that Linnea has on petro-masculinity for obvious reasons. Good morning, Linnea, and good morning, Sterling.
Good morning, Anthony.
Morning.
Actually, it's good afternoon for some people.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, sometimes you just got to laugh, and this is one of those times. Believe it or not, the left is pushing this idea of petro-masculinity, whereby, people that drive hot rods, or just use too much gasoline or whatever, it's a threat to humanity. Oh, no! Oh, my goodness.
No, it's worse than that. It's racist. If you read that article, it's racist. It's misogynistic. It's because it's hetero white males that are, I guess they're embracing fossil fuel machismo. I don't know. I don't go out and I think you and I had an exchange, Anthony. I don't go out and bathe in oil or gas. I don't go out and hug gas pumps when I'm fueling up. But I'm a big supporter of petroleum and all the benefits it provides us. I never thought of, I don't think when my mom fuels up her hybrid or my family fuels up, they think that they are somehow being, my female relatives feel they are being impressed by, suppressed by phallocentric society, because they're fueling their cars, but gosh, maybe deep in their subconscious they are. I don't know.
Yeah. So as our resident petro-feminist, Linnea, what do you have to think about all of this?
I don't like that word. I would much rather have my gender is going to be petro-masculinity. Petro-feminist doesn't sound too good. Man, everything comes back to the same handful of terms and complaints with them. I mentioned this when, what's her name? Sophia first tweeted that. I mentioned this on Twitter that, intersectionality is everything to these people. Mm-hmm. I mean, if they can't tie something to patriarchy or something, they will find a way. And it's one of the funnier parts of their ideology, but it's also one of the more annoying parts because you're trying to have a real discussion and there's really people who are actually being hurt by these policies that they're pushing. And then for them, it's all just a game. Mm-hmm. It's pretty gross. I don't like it.
In case someone in our audience doesn't know, of all the, the qualified people on this this podcast or this live stream each week, and gosh, I would wager the lady that tweeted that and wrote the articles, I wager you spent much more time on oil, actually working in the industry than any of us. So, if someone should really be affected by this, it would be you, right?
Yeah.
The oil man is keeping you down.
Well, and the craziest thing is, they make these claims all the time in the left, and this is something, it's a little bit off topic for our usual discussions, but male feminists and these people who complain about masculinity on the left are some of the most vile people towards women that I have ever seen. So when they get talking about how, you go ahead and drive your car, you enjoy car culture, you enjoy, I don't know, anything like being able to travel on your own terms, that kind of thing, that's some kind of a toxic masculine behavior.
Yeah.
All right. What?
Yeah,
I guess, but I don't know. They're the ones that are weirdos, so I'm not too worried about it.
I didn't know freedom, energy reliability, having plentiful food, having refrigeration that works, air conditioning, heating. I didn't know that those were white, heterosexual, male, misogynistic traits. I thought most people liked having plentiful food and being able, having the freedom to travel when they want to, without the government saying, show us your papers, show us your carbon ration card. It's, well, Anthony was right. Sometimes you just have to laugh. It's so absurd. It's just so
It is. It's
idiotic.
Just beyond absurd.
They keep saying,
absurd.
Yeah, they keep saying that scholars are using the term petro-masculinity as a what scholars? All right. I mean, I guess anyone can be a scholar if they
people from pop culture departments and sociology departments. I'm certain that people in the hard sciences aren't using this term.
Yeah.
No, and that's why everyone was laughing at it, and it's just silly.
All right, let's go back to that. This right here, this is my garage exhibit on petro-masculinity, right there. Someone asked about, is that a 4-barrel Holley carburetor, or are you just happy to see me? Well, there it is, folks, right there in all its glory, chrome glory, petro-masculinity. I'm proud of it. I drive it, and I should probably get something that says on the bumper, a bumper sticker that says, my other car is not electric. Anyway, that's my statement on petro-masculinity.
To be fair, even before this recent postmodern term of petro-masculinity was created, many people, not people necessarily who were complaining about fossil fuel use, but many people complained that some men use their cars as phallic. They want a fast car because the same people that say things like, well, if you like guns, it's just a phallic symbol, right? Well, if you have a hot rod, it's a phallic symbol. Well, Anthony, that's a pretty big phallic symbol right there. Wow. I'm classic car. I'm exhibiting some classic car envy right now.
Yeah, well, that particular truck has a story. My dad drove me to school every day in a truck just like this. This isn't the one. That's been lost to history, but one just like this, same color, same model year, except he had the straight 6 in it, and I've got a blueprinted V8 from Summit Racing, and yes, it goes. Anyway,
there you go.
So.
There you go. Yeah. What can you be fuel fluid? If there's petro-masculinity, can I self-identify as fuel fluid? That
you can identify as anything you want.
So I can identify as both petro-masculine and open to alternative fuels. If I weren't married and had a dating profile, could I say that?
Oh my goodness. Anyway, we're going to get the dating profiles. All right, but let's get to this next thing. This is Believe it or not, Petro-Masculinity is a peer-reviewed paper. You know why? Because that's what the left does. They take something absurd and turn it into a peer-reviewed paper in some obscure, useless journal that nobody reads, just for the ability to say, well, it's peer-reviewed, it's science, therefore it's true, right?
It shows how badly the peer review process has fallen when something like this gets published. Next, they'll publish something on how the mating habit of ants has been affected by climate change, and it's affecting modern music.
Yep. So we've got
Anthony. Wasn't there an article or a journal a couple of years ago? A couple of scientists got basically a rewrite of Mein Kampf published somewhere because they just kind of changed a few words and it passed peer review to accolades.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just look at the number of articles having to be withdrawn from journals or corrected in journals has skyrocketed in the past decade and a half.
Peer review, peer review boils down. I have been through the peer review process. People have asked me to peer review papers, and I have peer reviewed some, and I give it everything that I can. I throw out facts, I throw out objections, questions, whatever. But a lot of peer review is not like that. You think about how busy some of these people are, particularly like, people like Michael Mann, they're out there pushing this social agenda and all of these other crazy things. And they get some paper, they look at it and goes, yeah, I agree with that. And they read the abstract. Yeah, that looks about right. And that's all they have time for. A lot of scientists are this way. They simply do not take the time to dig into the data. And that's why Mein Kampf got peer reviewed. That's why Petro-Masculinity got peer reviewed. They don't spend the time to look at the absurdity or the data or anything.
I'll give you a personal example from my life. So when I was doing my graduate work, I was taking a course on decision theory in policy. And the professor that was teaching this course is one of the top people in his field. And I was reading some of these papers and my eyes were glazing over when I got to the weird form, the extended multi-line formulas with X over, with quotation, it's like I'd glaze over and I'd read what it said it was saying. And then I'd read what it said, summarized it as saying. And I went into class one day and because I discussed this with a few of my friends, my peers, and they were all like, I can't, that math, how do I check that math? And so I asked Ned, I said, look, these things have, you go through a peer review process. You're a peer reviewer. You write these things. I said, how many times when you have peer reviewed a paper like this, have you found the math not to work out? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you go and you read the formula and you see if the formula actually produces the result that they say it produces. And he says, well, it's never occurred to me to check the formula. I've never done that once in my entire career. And I said, then how do you know it's right? How do you know it passes them? I thought that's what peer review was. He goes, no, I can't think. He says, I can't think of a single person that I work with in this field who's ever checked formulas to see if they did the math right. Well, that's peer review.
You know what's going to happen next? Somebody's going to input a bunch of garbage into ChatGPT and have it make a peer-reviewed paper out of that. And it's going to get published under some name, and it's actually going to be under ChatGPT or some similar AI thing. Mark my word, it will happen.
Yeah, what he told us is he says, well, we know that our colleagues know what they're doing, and so we trust that they got the math right.
Sterling, you mentioned earlier that you wanted to know if you could put, biofuel, alternate fuels in your dating profile.
Fuel.
Well, believe it or not.
Is it hurting mine? It's not hurting mine. I've been married for 20 years this July. So
I know. But I mean, just more absurdity? Is petro-masculinity hurting your dating life? I mean, really.
If I were dating and any woman asked me anything about petro-masculinity, the date would end there. It's like if she said, "Oh, I'm feeling oppressed by fossil fuels," it's like, "Hun, let's get the check. You have a nice evening."
Yeah, as the resident single person here, though, OkCupid is probably one of the farthest left, other than specifically left-wing dating apps out there. It gives users like a special little star icon or a special little badge if they check that they're pro-choice on their profile, stuff like that. So
badges? We don't need no stinking badges.
You can pretty much just ignore. You can pretty much just ignore any data from OkCupid because it's super far left.
Oh my goodness. Yes, believe it or not. So, you know, it's just crazy. Now, we've got another one about another peer-reviewed publication is asking if petro-masculinity and climate change denial among white people, blah, 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 blah.
You know, white people.
That they're actually writing peer-reviewed things about how petro-masculinity and white people are a problem. It's just here. You had it, Andy. It's up there. It's just insane what they're going through here. And you know, I don't know how anyone can write, or much less read this stuff with a straight face. I mean, you really have to be brainwashed to think in these terms, in my view.
Well, if you were worried about climate, wouldn't it be let's see, coal is not petro. I don't know. Coal masculinity and yellow people, because you know China is the #1 producer of emissions. They are the top. If you worry about climate change, you got to worry about China. And I don't like the idea of white people, black people, yellow people. But if you're going to say white people, you know, look, China is the problem. Are we now to consider them white people? Maybe maybe. I don't know.
That first sentence is one of the best things I've ever read in this abstract. That is hilarious.
Read it out loud for us.
Okay, I'll read it for you. All right. White, politically conservative males in the United States have been widely found to maintain petro-masculine attitudes that include aspects of racism, misogyny, and climate change denial. Beautiful. They're missing a couple groups there, I think. But this is, yeah, wow. This is beautiful.
I bet petro-masculinity would correlate well with gun ownership myself.
Actually, I would tell people in here that, you know, this thing says this paper utilizes psychoanalytic concepts concerning individual and large group identity, psychodynamics and processes. This stuff is so abused, this kind of analysis. I don't normally, you know, give people directions to go to other YouTube channels, but there's one that I like that is a pretty solid psychoanalysis channel that does a pretty good job of explaining how this kind of data is being abused in even peer-reviewed literature. Sorry, I'm just cannot talk today. And that's there's a channel called Aiden Paladin, and she does a very good job of showing how a lot of this stuff is being abused to push certain narratives. And I thought I would have to give a little promotion there. Because it's important that people realize that a lot of this is just junk science, but a lot of people are willing to defer to it because of the terminology, and they claim that they're using all of this well-established psychoanalytical literature to make these points about group identity, and it's bunk.
I don't think I'll still worry about it if it happens, but we need to watch out for the diagnostic manual of the psychiatric diagnostic manual to see when they add petro-masculinity as a mental disorder in there.
We're laughing, but I could see something like climate change denial or petro-masculinity getting added to the DSM-5. I could see it because of how politicized it is.
Well, you know, if it does, it gives criminals another excuse when they do terrible things. Oh, I'm suffering from petro-masculinity that society forced upon me. Oh, my climate denial. I couldn't overcome how I was raised and as a climate denier when I smashed the weather station. I just, God.
Ooh, look at this. Jim just asked ChatGPT, what is petro-masculinity? A particular form of masculine identity that values dominance, toughness, and control. Well, that sounds like I'm driving a hot rod to me.
Well, you know, one of the things that I saw in one of those articles is they said the petro-masculine identifies with authoritarianism. And I think that's curious because I've often been accused of being or aligning with the Nazis, right? And I don't think the people who sling these terms about, authoritarian, Nazis, I don't think they've ever really understood what that means. I'm with the Heartland Institute. We are a fairly libertarian organization, and libertarianism, by definition, is not authoritarian. In fact, what I fight for every day is liberty and freedom. I want people to have choice, not to have some top-down dictatorial policy telling me when I can travel, how I can cook. I'm for freedom, folks. And so how can I be authoritarian? It's the people who are pushing climate alarmism, the people who are pushing top-down rules, telling you how you can live your life, how you can travel. They're the authoritarians.
Yeah. All right. So the next thing they're after, you know, they don't want you to be having, you know, gasoline-powered vehicles and all these things. They're going after your barbecue now. Yes, that's right. Petro-masculinity has invaded the barbecue. This guy here decides that, you know, using propane or charcoal briquettes or whatever is petro-masculine, and therefore it must be stopped. What does he do? He hooks up his ionic electric car to an electric grill. Yes, he runs a cord over to his electric grill and starts barbecuing soy burgers. Yeah.
More power to him. More power to him.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything more male than a few guys standing around the barbecue with, you know, some beers and some charcoal? I mean, we even had a cartoon series about it, King of the Hill. You know, his whole thing was selling propane barbecues and propane accessories. Yeah. You know, and it's harmless. Yet these folks are just taking things that we do as everyday Americans, which is all right, and turning it into comedy and turning it into derision, you know, because we can't have people standing around the barbecue because it's using fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are evil and it's misogynistic and all this other rubbish. As he sits
around his barbecue, sipping organic Chardonnay and grilling organic soy and kale. That's the barbecue I want to be invited to.
All right. So while we're on the topic of gas, you know, there's been a whole thing about gas stoves. You know, they're out to take away your gas stoves. Now, incredibly, Senator Chuck Schumer sent a message out on Twitter some months ago. This idea that we're after your gas stoves, that's just bunk. We're not after that. You know, we're not coming for your gas stoves. Well, here you go. A few months later, we've actually got a law in New York that says new construction will not have natural powered gas stoves. You know
who they've exempted from that?
Who?
Commercial kitchens. They don't want Gordon Ramsay and his friends to move out of the city, to close their restaurants so the rich can have their fine dining. So they're exempting probably some of the biggest users of natural gas. And if you're worried about the stoves causing health problems, the people that are most exposed to natural gas on a daily basis and the fumes from it, they're exempted from these laws. It's just the average folks who will suffer with more expensive, less effective means of cooking. And like you said, a few years ago, it leaked out the Biden administration was coming after your gas stoves. And there was a huge backlash. And the Biden administration quickly walked it back and said, no, we're not. We're not. That's just a MAGA talking point. That's just Republicans trying to gin up opposition to our reasonable climate policies. But we're not coming after your gas stoves. And of course, they've issued their own regulation that would cut out more than 60% of the gas of the stoves on the market, almost all of them gas. So, folks, when you see a leak and it tells you a bad thing's coming, and then the administration immediately says, no, that's wrong. We'd never do that. Know that they are lying.
Yes, they are professional liars. Just watch it any day of the week, and you'll see these same kinds of contradictions.
If you want to know when a politician is lying, for most of them, it's when their lips are moving.
Right. Indeed it is. All right. So one of the things that we do here on Climate Realism is we put out knowledge on a weekly basis, not just here on the show, but also on our Climate Realism website, climaterealism.com, and climateataglance.com. These are all about facts, and Climate Realism factually makes rebuttals every day of the week on some idiocy that's going on in the media where the reporters can't even do basic research to find out the facts, and they just go with the narrative. And it's the same thing on Climate at a Glance, but it's a bit on the more on the sciencey side, where we have peer-reviewed references to all of the different things that we're talking about. And we take on different topics at climateataglance.com. And of course, we have our book, Climate at a Glance, which you can get on Amazon, which covers 30 different topics, all factually based. The left hates this because they don't deal in facts. They deal in emotions and rhetoric, and that's all they're about. But interestingly enough, there was a study that was published that says environmental knowledge is inversely associated with climate change anxiety. In other words, the more you know about climate change, the less anxious you are about it. This is a topic that Sterling suggested, and we're going to cover it. But it's absolutely true. And I've gone through this with people that have come to my blog at whatsupwiththat.com and gone through the process of reading several articles. And they learn, they understand that eventually, wait, it's not so bad. You're not going to hell in a handbasket tomorrow. The models are not data. Maybe this is all wrong. That's the thing. The left pushes this as if it's factual when it's almost all projection, not just on the data side with climate models, but on the social side. There's lots of projection going on there. Now, interestingly enough, last week, Congressman Doug LaMalfa, who is the representative of the 1st District in Northern California, went before Congress on a hearing and decided to ask some factual questions. He wanted to know things like, what is the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? He put it to some people, and the results were hilarious. If we've got that video, let's run it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panelists, let me just go right down the line real fast. What percent of our atmosphere is CO2? Take your best guess. You don't have to be accurate. All down the line.
Repeat that question.
What percent of our atmosphere is CO2, carbon dioxide? Wild guess. It's okay.
I'll bite 5%.
5?
I'll just follow you then.
We'll go 7.
I'll see their 5 and suggest that we know that transportation causes 49% of CO2. So that's why we're all working on energy transition.
All right. So what number do you think it is?
5.
5? How about you? I didn't hear you, Mr. Dreher.
7.
7. Did you have one, Mr. Boyd?
So we got a 5, 7.
This Price is Right.
8. Don't get the high end.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, and I don't mean to put you on ice. I ask a lot of people that because all we hear is climate change, CO2, CO2. I heard a couple of you on the panel saying you're looking to change your vehicles to electric, even though we don't have the electric grid. And me as a farmer, I wouldn't be real happy about running out and replacing $300,000, $500,000, $1 million pieces of equipment because someone wants it to be electric. The answer is 0.04%, not 1%, not a half of a percent. It's 0.04%, and it's gone up from 0.03 over the last couple decades. This is what we're being all contorted into doing, is this tiny change in CO2. If we get below 0.02, plant life starts dying off. So let me ask Mr. Boyd, what are a lot of your vehicles Tier 4 already, or the vehicles that you know about?
Yeah, I think.
Anyway, that's Doug Lamolfa, the congressman for the 1st District in Northern California, asking the most basic of questions: how much is the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And these people that are out espousing electric vehicles and changing the grid and changing our energy policy and all this stuff can't even answer this most basic question.
And it was hilarious when the woman said, and we know that 49% of the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere are from transportation. So no, we don't know that. The vast majority of CO2 in the atmosphere is natural.
Yeah, I know.
It's ridiculous, which gets back to that initial, that study. It's like, look, the more you know about the science of climate change, not, the idea, which tells the science of climate change. The more you know about the actual science, the less concerned you are about an existential threat to survival. These politicians must know almost nothing about the science if they really believe what they're saying when they say the seas are going to swamp Florida and it's an existential threat to human survival. I don't know how many times I've heard the term existential crisis, existential threat. If they really believe that, they just don't know the science. And when you learn the science, you're less concerned. And what's funny is Republicans in general are generally tarred as more anti-science, don't understand science. And yet poll after poll shows when regular pollers, not push polling, Gallup or Pew or, pick the polling service, when they ask particular people by political party about science questions, it turns out Republicans almost always do better than Democrats, who say they're the party of science, that they follow the science, and yet they don't know the science. They follow the faux science. They follow the popular opinion as generated by the mainstream media. They do not understand or follow what science actually says about climate or almost anything else, I suspect.
Hey, you've been awfully quiet.
Well, it's like Sterling said, it's basically that from my observations, people who are extremely worried about climate change are people who claim to really love science, but what they really love is pop science. They love the small, the short little surface level factoids and stuff. And then they're like, oh, it's so cool because you can do this minor chemistry experiment that does a cool effect or whatever. That kind of stuff is what they mean when they say that they love the science. They also love the science that gets reported on whatever their preference of news channel is. They have no interest in looking into the debate. They have no interest in looking into the more tedious parts of the scientific process. They don't like science. They like pop science, and that's what it comes down to.
It's true. And, it's not just them. It's the mainstream media. We deal with this every day. The mainstream media is caught up in pop science. They will say that someone will say, some so-called expert, climate change is making X worse. And they'll just, like a trout with a fly, they will grab that and they will run with it. And they don't even look anywhere else. A good example happened this week is something that we published on climate realism, as an article I wrote. Climate change is not increasing wildfires in Anchorage. Now, this was sent out by the Associated Press, and it got wide review and publication all over the place. But the simple thing is that if you scroll down in this article, you see there's lots of data that shows that climate is the smallest of all of the possible factors. For example, humans cause more fires in Alaska. You know, lightning causes more fires in Alaska. And that's linked to the expanding population of Alaska. Alaska's population has like octupled over the last 40 years or so. And in Anchorage alone, the population has gone up 25 times. And so they're expanding out into, you know, making more suburbs. And in Anchorage, the suburbs are all in the trees, right? So, you know, someone has an accident in their garage, or they're out there using a tool that creates a spark, or whatever, the typical things that cause a fire. There's more and more of that. Climate change is actually very minuscule in the process. And the whole interesting thing about it is, in the middle of all this, if you scroll down a little further, you find that there is increasingly amount of, they're talking about drought, you know, and lightning. Well, more frequent lightning in Alaska has to do with the fact that humans, when they have population centers, create more what's called condensation nuclei. And the condensation nuclei are tiny particles that seed, you know, precipitation. And so, and thunderstorms develop from that. And so more lightning is directly correlated in a peer-reviewed paper to having more condensation nuclei. And then finally, if we scroll down a little bit further, there's the fact that it's actually getting wetter in Alaska, increased precipitation, yet they're talking about drought and climate change. It's just absurd.
Yeah, they actually, it's an interesting article because they actually have some of the data and then they ignore their own research about the data. It's like, we have a narrative, we'll throw in a few facts, but we'll dutifully ignore those facts because they don't actually fit the narrative.
That's the most astonishing part of a lot of these papers, and especially if you get into reading the literature that they cite. It's distressing if you're a person who's really trying to find the truth, because you'll read these papers in the abstract. It'll say, we have found that climate change is causing X and Y. And then you read the actual body of the paper, and it doesn't show that. And you don't even have to be an expert in whatever field they're in to see that what they're claiming is an exaggeration at best, totally made up out of whole cloth at worst, in the papers themselves. And what I think is happening, and this is, I'm going to put my little tinfoil hat on, what I think is happening is that they're specifically generating papers to use to generate news articles to attribute climate change to things. I don't think, I think that these papers that they cite a lot of the time are made specifically so that they can be cited in newspaper articles like this.
I agree 100%. I've seen a lot of articles that are written in such a way, peer-reviewed articles that are written in such a way that they include key phrases in the abstract. And these key phrases are like dog whistles for some of these reporters. You know, they look at that. Ooh, yeah, I remember writing about 2 months ago, you know, and all that stuff. And it just, they zero in on it. And then someone like a reporter at AP, the Seth Borenstein, for example, who's probably the worst of all with this stuff, he gets one of these things and he just runs with it. You know, and he doesn't look into the data. He just accepts whatever is said by the press release coming out of the university or the abstract in the paper as fact. Even if the thing further down in the paper says, well, you know, it's really kind of limited because of so-and-so. A lot of these papers are that way. They will make these bold claims in the press releases or in the abstract. And then when you get down to the nitty gritty and you go through the data and you go through the citation and you go through, you know, the graphs or the whatever, it's not as bad as it sounds in the headline. And yet the headline is what gets the attention of these reporters. And that's what's really miserable about all of this stuff. It's just, go ahead.
One of the prime examples of that was when they released RCP 8.5, right? They
that's
released
the climate model.
They released the scenarios, the most egregious, the one that shows the worst temperature rise, the worst impacts was RCP 8.5. That got all the headlines. That also got all the notoriety in the press releases.
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds, if not thousands, of peer-reviewed articles have been published, and who knows, untold numbers of media stories have been generated referencing the scenarios produced by RCP 8.5. And after about 2 years, the people who put this out started quietly saying, well, RCP 8.5 is not really the expectation. It's not really realistic. It's not really what we intended you to. We didn't intend you to take away, but that's what we focused on in our press release. In fact, RCP 8.5 is basically impossible. The planet is not nearly on that trajectory, but they didn't say that. And it was 2 years later, they start coming out very quietly. They didn't release a new paper saying RC, but some people have done that. But it's like closing the barn door after the horses have left, right? We've done our damage, and now we can admit, well, that was a lie. But I mean, it's still bad, but it's not as bad as we had said or we had implied. They clearly, if they only read our paper, they'd know that we didn't really mean that.
Well, it's a problem.
Well,
it's
go ahead,
a problem.
Linnea.
Sorry, it's a problem when when you have a study coming out in Nature or something where they're saying this is what the impact is going to be on X and Y lake or whatever, evaporation, whatever. And they'll do this thing where they'll take a handful of scenarios to run through their their simulation that they create for whatever situation they're trying to model, right? And they'll choose the lowest end or like the extreme intervention taken on emissions. They'll take a kind of middle range and they'll take RCP 8.5. And what that does is it skews the data in the direction of the impossible. The fact that they're including RCP 8.5 in their scenarios is going to skew their results towards a more intense version of what it would be otherwise. I mean, and there are some scientists out there who are starting to say, we need to throw this out entirely. No one should be referencing this thing in any of their articles or any of their papers because it's so impossible that to use it in your paper is like, I don't know, having a scenario where half of warming is caused by unicorns or something. I mean, putting it into your paper is akin to just making stuff up and then using that as your frame of reference.
Well, most of the time they refer to RCP 8.5 as business as usual. It's like, well, what business as usual are you talking about? I see a lot of wind turbines and solar panels going up. I see electric vehicles being produced. That's the business as usual. You say produces RCP 8.5?
Yeah. So we wrote about this 2 years ago, on climate realism. And finally, science started to self-correct. But it wasn't until they realized that it was completely impossible because we didn't have enough fossil fuels on the planet to burn to create enough carbon dioxide to get to the level of they're talking about of warming with RCP 8.5. And so the reality versus the models, once again, complete disparity.
But it's not, I'm sorry, Anthony, but it's not correcting. Maybe a few scientists are out there, but it's like the Piltdown Man. When the Piltdown Man was shown to be a fraud, no one talked about it anymore. No one tried to defend it anymore. They're still publishing articles that use RCP 8.5 as the scenario. So I wish it had been as definitively defeated as the Piltdown Man, but it certainly hasn't been. They're still writing about it.
Yeah.
And I would argue that probably a majority of the articles writing about it are referencing RCP 8.5 as opposed to the realistic, still wrong, but more realistic scenarios.
Yeah. It's amazing how bad science is at self-correcting. And I think a lot of it has to do with follow the money. It boils down to the fact that science, particularly climate science, is a big business now. I mean, look at the millions and millions, billions even of dollars that's gone into climate change research. There are entire university empires built around climate change research. And as a result, they've got this money gravy train going, you know. Meanwhile, they're saying, oh, these evil deniers accepted $10 from some petrochemical company. You know, we have to stop that. But meanwhile, they're collecting millions, you know. The same people that are collecting millions are saying, you know, the climate skeptics, climate realists like ourselves shouldn't have any money at all. We should be jailed. We should be sanctioned, all of these things, because their opinion is basically hurting our bottom line. That's what it boils down to. That's what it boils down to.
It's hurting their grab for power is what it is. It's undermining their effective attempt to seize power over your lives. And Eisenhower warned about this in his farewell address.
Right, he sure did.
Everyone remembers the military industrial complex. This whole second half of his speech was about the dangers of big science being co-opted by government.
Right. And almost all climate science is funded by government. Yeah, there's some other organizations out there that are funding climate science, but the big dollars is coming from government. And of course, all of the data that we get, the surface temperature data and everything, is all gathered by the government. The National Weather Service and NOAA gather all the climate data, not just for the United States, but for the world. All the stuff that's elsewhere in the surface temperature network goes through NOAA. And so they essentially have a monopoly on the data. They have an essential monopoly on the funding. So what does that leave you with? A monopoly in education in the universities, that climate change is a big business and it's all monopolized thanks to money. All right, so we're going to move on to some other topics here, some of the things that have been in the news this week. For example, you know, wind turbines have always been a topic that we've talked about. So they put up one at a high school because, you know, we want to educate all these young students about the value of wind power. And what happens? It falls down. Yeah, fortunately, no one was hurt or killed. But, you know, gosh, what a message to send, right?
You got to be really. It's really fortunate they didn't site it closer to the school itself.
Yep.
And when one of those things collapses, anything underneath it's crushed.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's just amazing. You know, I remember 20 years ago being on the big island of Hawaii and being at what's called South Point. And there was a wind turbine farm there, one of the very first. And this thing this had huge monster turbines, a lot like these. And these things were standing there as like derelicts. They almost all of them were broken. They were rusted, they were broken, they were silent because things, you know, in the gearbox or whatever had broken, and they just didn't work anymore. And yet they're just left there to rot.
Yeah, in Hawaii, they don't have the landfill space to dispose of wind turbines, so they just leave them rotting. Standing monuments to failed energy is what I consider them.
Yeah, they're like the, you know, what are those things on Easter Island? Those monoliths on Easter Island. That's what they looked like.
Failed culture.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if the wind blew it over or whether it was metal fatigue or whatever, but I do want to tell you an inside story, and you'll only hear it here, about wind turbines. My brother-in-law happened to be the president of the Cincinnati Gear Company, a company that made large gears and gearboxes and things like that. They made gearboxes for ships for the U.S. Navy. Monster gears, you know, things that are like 8 feet in diameter, that kind of stuff. His company got into the business of making gearboxes for wind turbines in Southern California at the Tehachapi Wind Farm. And they thought, oh, this is a piece of cake. This is a cakewalk because we've done it for ships, you know, harsh marine environments and so forth and so on. And so they designed and sold gearboxes for these wind turbines in Tehachapi. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever driven on Highway 58 from Highway 99 over into the desert. But if you drive that, you'll see all these wind farms. I mean, they're all over the landscape because there's huge winds that run through those passes. Anyway, bottom line is that these gearboxes that Cincinnati Gear made shook themselves to death. And the company could not keep up with warranty claims on these things because the environment of running in a ship while, you know, having salt water and all that stuff is an entirely different environment than running on top of a mast where it's shaking and vibrating all the time. And these things basically just shook themselves to death and stopped working, which I believe is the same thing that happened on the South Point in Hawaii. As a result, the company went bankrupt. Cincinnati Gear kaput because of getting into the business of providing gearboxes for wind turbines.
Yeah.
How you like that?
People think they maintain themselves and they don't.
Yep. All right, next topic. Oh, go ahead, Linnea.
Said it's major industrial equipment, and it's not kind of equipment that's kind of has an energy density of any kind. It's super spread out and everything, a little harder to maintain than one factory sitting on half acre. No, it's way more than the half acre on like bigger electrical generation facilities and stuff. But man, it's not working out for them at all.
Oh, no, it is not.
I've heard some stories of them flinging their blades across highways and stuff when they just explode mid turn. So that's kind of fun. Not so good.
It's not working for ratepayers and companies and homeowners. It is working for the big businesses that are profiting from it. They're making money hand over fist, those politically connected industries.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, thanks, Andy. Yes, there it is. Those things just rip themselves apart. You don't even need tornadoes for those things to fail.
No, yeah. If the brakes fail during high wind, it's over.
Yep. All right, final topic for the day, pollen. We've got this article on climate realism that Linnea wrote, where NBC News is saying an increase in pollen indicates plants are thriving. It's not bad news. Well, we've known this because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased, and NOAA satellites have looked at the greening of the planet and found that over the last 30 years, an area the size of the United States has gotten more green with plants because of increased carbon dioxide. But basically now what they're doing is saying climate change is causing more pollen, Linnea, what's this about?
Well, they hate plants. I'm convinced that some of the worst of these people are like the mayor in the Lorax, where he just wants everything replaced by artificial trees and stuff. Because so they want to not have global warming because the onset of spring occurs a little bit earlier. They're saying it occurs maybe a few days to a little more than that. Earlier compared to the beginning of the 20th century. It's really hard to find a negative to that because you're increasing your planting season for crops. If it's good for wild plants, it's going to be good for crops. They're saying that this is a problem because older people are starting to get seasonal allergies that they didn't have before because there's more pollen in the spring. And maybe it's earlier. I had pollen allergies for the first time in my life this year, but I moved to the Southeast and that will do it. It's got a lot worse pollen burst in the spring than other places. I think it's pretty much famous for how bad the pollen season is. But, a lot of people apparently are noticing this, or at least these doctors are saying that they're noticing more people coming in for allergies. I'm very skeptical of the data that they claim that there's 20% more pollen in the air over the last 30 years. Kind of questioning how they're measuring that. I don't think that we've had pollen reports for very much longer than that. So I'm not really sure where they're getting that from. It's just weird. I read another article that was talking about how more tree growth is actually bad for the planet. More plant growth is bad for the planet because in some cases where trees cover up snow on the ground, it changes the albedo so that it actually has a warming effect. But of course, if there's not snow on the ground, trees have a higher albedo than dirt does. So that doesn't work at all unless you're in a snowy area. And like Sterling added to my article, evergreens are pretty much the only scenario where that matters, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know, but don't you want your cold to be a little bit moderated in the winter and your hot a little bit moderated in the summer, which is what trees do?
Don't you want?
They hate all of it.
If you're a climate alarmist, don't you want more CO2 sucked out of the atmosphere? I mean, I think it may be true that pollen is up. If plant growth is up, pollen should be up. I mean, it's one follows the other pretty much. I think that it could cause an increase in allergies, and that's a price we pay for the tremendous beneficial effects of greening. Now, you mentioned the Lorax. I think that's very funny. I didn't know that, but I remember as a youth watching a movie called Silent Running. And if it had the first little robots, even predating Star Wars, the C-3PO, they had a robot that was very similar to that. And had Bruce Dern, and all the plant life on Earth was basically up in these pods in space. And he was tending the plant life, and everything else was industrialized. So I guess nobody would have allergies down there. We're all benefiting under Silent Running, of course, until they send them the message that we have to start destroying all these things because it's costing us too much to run them. The spaceships, you're coming back home, jettison your plant pods.
Yeah. Okay. So we're almost out of time. We got to get to some of the questions that have been posed by our viewers. So let's bring up the first one and see what they have to say. What's the first question? How much CO2% in atmosphere is the question? I don't get that. We've already covered that. It's 0.04%. Is it? All right, here we go. Question. Net Power Demonstration Facility in LaPorte, Texas. A closed-loop natural gas plant emits no emissions. Where does the exhaust go? Sterling, you know anything about this?
No. I suspect if it's closed loop, they've got some kind of reservoir, underground reservoir, maybe an old oil field that they're pumping to, but I'm not familiar with that particular project.
All right, next one. I see these commercials on television. Put solar on your house. They state it pays for itself in 10 years. Government subsidies will help you pay. And what's the viability of a solar panel? Well, I've put up in my lifetime 3 solar panel projects. One for the school system in Chico, California, was when I was on the school board there. And then 2 on my homes. I did it not to save the planet, but because it was the only hedge against increased electricity prices with PG&E and all of their greed. And the bottom line is this. Crystalline solar silicon panels have a lifetime somewhere, a usable lifetime, somewhere between 20 and 25 years. If you're lucky, you can get them paid off somewhere in around 10 or 15 years. And then after that, it's all gravy. But the bottom line is that you've got to figure out what to do with them after that because they stop producing. They slow way down. The molecular structure changes and they're not as efficient. So do you keep running them until they break or do you replace them? What? So we've got a big waste disposal problem coming up here, folks, in the not too distant future of all these solar panels that are going to go dead and stinking.
And I'm not even convinced that they pay for themselves. I mean, while you're paying them off, you're still paying for electricity because you're still hooked up to the grid paying. There was a planned community around Austin, Texas, where they used to advertise it was going to be 100% carbon free because every home was going to have solar panels. And I did the calculation, and the solar panels were going to fail approximately the time it was going to pay off the extra cost of the house to have the solar panels. So they would never pay themselves off. You'd have to constantly replace them, and in replacing them, you're adding to the cost of the home. I'm unconvinced they pay themselves off unless they operate every time. None of them break in a storm. In Texas, we have tornadoes. None of them are ripped from the roof or a tree limbs thrown through them. Under the perfect scenario, you keep them clean, so you keep dust off of them regularly. I don't think they ever pay themselves off, but that's okay because taxpayers in the form of government subsidies pay off some of it anyway.
Yeah, right. You know, it's free if you get it from the government, right?
Right.
Ugh. All right. Next question or comment. We have just a moment of time left. If you happen to see a wind turbine without turning it, it's because it has exceeded the demand and that excess is paid.
Sometimes that's true. Sometimes they cut them off, or they disconnect them. They disconnect them in a sense from the grid when there's too much demand. If they can't ship the power elsewhere. But a lot of times that's not the case. I was at a Society for Environmental Journalists conference, and we went. It was in Pittsburgh, and we went up to the mountains, and they were bragging going up there that, oh, we've reached 30% efficiency. They're operating 30% of the time. And we asked the on-site manager, because when we stood there, not a single one of them was turning. And he proudly bragged. The PR people were saying 30% of the time, 30 to 35% of the time. He said, we've finally reached this year 20% operation. And it wasn't as if they were shut down for the reasons Doug Pollock says. They were shut down because there was no wind blowing. And so we asked him, well, where are they getting the power now? He goes, well, mostly around here, nuclear. So it's like, sometimes that's true, but most of the time when they're not operating is because the wind is either insufficient or blowing too hard.
Right. Yeah. And when that's happening, you got to go back to the grid. That's the backup. Anyway, thank you everyone for being here today on Climate Change Roundtable number 62. We appreciate you watching. Remember to give us a like, remember to subscribe, and remember to join us soon again. Now, next week, I will not be here. I'm going off on a fossil-fueled trip. Yes, that's right. I'm going to fly somewhere. Anyway, so we won't be here next week. We'll have some kind of a substitute show. But I want to thank you for watching that if you get a chance to tune in. Remember to check out climaterealism.com, climateataglance.com. And we have, I forgot. We have a new one, Linnea's new website, energyataglance.com. Check it out, energyataglance.com. It is way cool, way cool. All right, that's it for us. Have a great weekend, everybody. And remember, have a steak and support the carbon dioxide from those cows.
How dare you!